The Gemara tells us, Potchim b'chvod achsania. When one begins remarks, specifically as a visitor, you begin with acknowledging the hospitality you've received. And so this is the concluding Shabbat of my summer guest series at Beth Tikvah. It is my honor to express my appreciation to the congregation of Beth Tikvah for the warmth, the incredible warmth you've exhibited to me and to each other, beginning with the security guards at the door. And there's incredible warmth and friendliness that one like me who visits a lot of shuls notices when it's not there, but it's certainly there here. So Yishar Kochachem as a community. And this is a community that I've learned in these last, including today, 5 Shabbatot that I've been here, that has a very, very special collection of Klei Kodesh, wonderful clergy. And start with Chazan Tibor Kovari. I've only been privileged for 2 weeks to be here with you at the same time, but clearly one of the great Chazanim of our day and fabulous Chazan, but also equally a fabulous mensch. So Toda Rabbi for your leadership. And I'll just acknowledge as well while I say this that you, as a congregation, have great lay leadership as well, great lay daveners, and very impressive to see. And the sauce of Beth Tikvah I've learned is Irv Kirschenblatt, who is just wonderful. And I learned after my first 5 minutes here why everyone loves him. And so it's been a pleasure to work with Irv, and I'm just delighted by having had that opportunity. So I haven't had the opportunity to be here at the same time as Rabbi Grover. I've known him for several years and admired him. But I've never worked alongside him because I'm replacing him during these weeks, so he's not here. But I'll make a confession. I watched him on live stream last Shabbat. And I want to point out that historically, rabbis, and me especially, are very critical of other rabbis when they give sermons. Very critical. Last Shabbat, I listened to his sermon. There was nothing to criticize. It was wonderful, brilliantly constructed, powerful, meaningful, moving, and a very, very significant message. So you're very blessed with a very gifted rabbi, wonderful chazan, and a beautiful ritual director. And so I want to say what a privilege it has been during these few weeks to share involvement with them. And you have something really good here. Hold on to it and love it and appreciate it because it really is special. Now to Inyana Diyoma, now back to matters at hand. In the early years of the 20th century, a word was added to the lexicon of modern Hebrew, le'avreit, to Hebrayize. From the beginning of the first Aliyah in 1882 to the end of the second Aliyah in 1914, the first 2 large-scale Zionist migrations to pre-state Israel, and continuing through statehood and beyond, many immigrants chose to change their surnames from their European origins into equivalent Hebrew names. Most famously, David Grun from Plonsk became David Ben-Gurion, and 6 who would follow Ben-Gurion as prime minister would change their names as well. Moshe Shertak would become Moshe Sharet, Levi Shkolnik would become Levi Eshkol, Golda Meyerson, of course, Golda Meir, Yitzhak Yerzhnitsky would become Yitzhak Shamir, Shimon Persky, Shimon Peres. Interestingly, Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, refused to Hebrayize his name, but his successor, Yitzhak Shimshelovich, would become Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, and Israel's third president, Zalman Shazar's original name was reflective of his Hasidic roots, Shneir Zalman Lubashov. It was not always, though, through personal choice that Israel's leaders with European origin names undertook the Hebraization process. Indeed, as prime minister, David Ben-Gurion required state and diplomatic officials and army officers to adopt Hebrew surnames. He felt it incumbent upon those representing the state of Israel to sever links with the old world, and in so doing to identify totally and exclusively with the fledgling Jewish homeland of Israel. But one who resisted Ben-Gurion's pressure was Menachem Begin, who adamantly refused to change his name. His disagreeing with Ben-Gurion was no surprise since they agreed on virtually nothing. But his persistence in retaining his birth name reflected his belief that the new, even something as precious to him as the state of Israel, for which he had fought his entire life and for which on many occasions put his life and his freedom on the line, his persistence reflected his belief that the new should not replace the old. The richness of heritage and Jewish tradition of the ages could only enhance and strengthen what was being created in modern-day Israel. When Begin was called to testify before a Knesset commission late in his life, when asked his name, he replied, Menachem ben Dov v'Chasya Begin. His Israeli name and his Jewish name, in his view, were one and the same. So who was right? Was Ben-Gurion right to suggest a clean break with the past? That the Zionist enterprise entailed a new beginning, total change, and separation from yesterday's world? Was he right in assuming that the Israeli represented the new Jew, captured so vividly in posters of the 1950s, whether in army uniform or on the kibbutz with kova tembel and shorts, on hands and knees planting saplings in the ground? Was he right in asserting that every identifying feature of the Israeli, especially his or her name, had to reflect the new facts on the ground, with the need la'avrei to transition in total to the Hebrew-speaking state? Or was Begin right, that it was still appropriate, even necessary, to respect and never reject the past, even the recent past, with its pains and frustrations, that it was important to carry with us symbolically as we would make it to the shores of Israel, those who came before us. That by preserving their names, we would be strengthening our resolve to actualize the dreams that was always in the hearts and prayers of previous generations. And in the living memory of many of you here today, on these very shores of North America, in our own community here, many Jewish immigrants and many of the first generation to be born here changed their names as well, because anti-Semitism in the workplace and in society made it difficult at times, very difficult, for Jews with overtly Jewish-sounding names to acclimatize in a less than friendly environment and to find employment and success during times of economic adversity. The fact that first and second generations North Americans found it necessary to anglicize their surnames in most cases had little bearing on their sense of Jewish commitment or identity. Many, if not most, were instrumental in building and strengthening our local communities, our synagogues, our Jewish schools. Their name changes were rarely ideological, not seeking to distance themselves from their heritage or peoplehood, but rather practical, making it easier to acculturate and intended to help their children more readily find acceptance and opportunity in the new world. So change, whether it be one's name, one's location, one's career, one's religion, is rarely easy. It can be incredibly tough. Indeed, the major theme of the month of Elul, which began this week, and of the soon-to-be upon us High Holy Days, is change, which in a sense we call tshuva. Literally, tshuva means return, and it is usually translated as repentance. But in fact, tshuva is change. The month of Elul and the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, the 10 days of tshuva that begin with Rosh Hashanah, culminating on Yom Kippur, are supposed to lead to a personal commitment to make changes in our lives, in terms of our connection to the Jewish people and tradition, and in terms of our relationships with each other. In his monumental Hilchot Tshuva, his laws of Tshuva, the great Rambam Maimonides reminds us how easy it is when it comes to Tshuva to talk the talk but not walk the walk. In his words, Kol hamitvadeh b'dvarim v'lo gamar b'libo la'azov, one who verbally admits wrongdoing but doesn't really resolve in his or her heart to make the necessary changes, harei zeh domeh letovel v'sheretz biyado. He's like a person who became impure through contact with a reptile, who then immerses himself in the mikvah while holding on to the reptile. The Rambam reminds us, Ad sheyashlich hasheretz, until he casts off the reptile. In other words, until he changes his behavior. His act of tshuva is meaningless. Change, often rapid change, surrounds us in every aspect of society, and especially in technology. What was state-of-the-art before I began this sermon could become obsolete before the end of Musaf today. And religion too. Judaism in particular has been subject to change. And I'm not speaking only of the modern period. Much of Torah law was modified in the rabbinic period some 2,000 years ago, to the extent that the Midrash tells us that when Moses was transported to the yeshiva of Rabbi Akiva in the early 2nd century, he didn't understand a word of what was being discussed. So dramatic were the shifts in law and interpretation from the biblical to the rabbinic period. So the biblical law of loans being forgiven in the Shemitah year was revamped by the great Hillel in what was called prosbul, whereby instead of being forgiven, the loan was transferred to the courts. When the Torah law alone was enforced, the economy and the poor suffered because people stopped making loans since they knew they would never be repaid. And so ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye, and similar harsh biblical penalties for inflicting injury were reinterpreted by the sages to mean financial compensation, a rather modern legal understanding offered millennia ago by our sages, changing the biblical code to conform to more up-to-date sensibilities. Change is never easy. There'll always be purists. In the US, they're known as constructionists, who fear any modification in interpretation of codified law. And there'll always be those on the other end of the spectrum who will be too quick to change, not taking the time and the consideration necessary to balance reverence for the past and sensitivity to the present. Just as name changes were challenging in the early years of the 20th century, here and in Israel, other adaptations and modifications of community standards were achieved not without difficult decades of debate, controversy, and sometimes division and discord. When I arrived in Toronto almost 45 years ago, a new graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary, I was a proud member of the right wing of my graduating class. I was very comfortable with our shul practice then, when women were excluded from Torah honors and not counted in the minyan. I never imagined that we would change that policy, nor that I would be the one spearheading that change. It took me years here in my rabbinic work to recognize the disconnect between my non-egalitarian standard and the desire to empower all congregants, male and female, into the spiritual life of the community. I love the story told by the late modern Orthodox rabbinic leader, Rabbi David Hartman, who received a panicked phone call from one of his former students, who was then serving as a synagogue rabbi in the US. The call went something like this: Rabbi Hartman, we're about to daven mincha, but there are 7 men in the shul and 5 women. What do I do? And Rabbi Hartman's succinct 2-word reply to his student went like this: idiot daven. I love his response, because it was my discomfort with leaving 5 women and 7 men waiting to daven mincha, while searching in the parking lot for male stragglers, and the inevitable joke that we should convert the janitor to make the minyan, that led me, in Rabbi Hartman's style, to tell the Shaliach Tzibor, I didn't say idiot, but I said daven, to start the service without 10 males present. Minyan intended to create community, especially when much of that community consists of the recently bereaved, can't succeed when its building of community is exclusionary and hurt-inducing. Change in religion takes time. The balancing act between traditional practice and modern sensitivity is not easy. Respect for both is essential to maintain communal equilibrium and to enable change when appropriate, when morally correct, when sensible, to be understood and accepted by the community. A more recent change in my rabbinic practice, with much less impact on the congregation, but which received substantial media attention, involved my performance of a commitment ceremony between two males several years back, one from a Beth David family and the other from a Beth Tikvah family. I'd served on the Conservative Movement Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, known as the CJLS, a decade ago, when the issue of allowing for such ceremonies, along with much greater acceptance of gay, lesbian, and trans relationships, was brought to a vote. The tshuva, the response on permitting the change, was passed by a vote of 13 to 12. 13 in favor, 12 opposed. Back in December 2006 at the CJLS meeting at Park Avenue Synagogue, with media crews outside awaiting our decision, I was one of the 12 no votes, not yet ready to say yes to what would represent a dramatic departure from normative Jewish practice. My change was not calculated, nor did I anticipate it. Like my change in terms of accepting women's ritual participation, it was the human element, real people, real situations that moved me to reconsider. But a decade following the law committee vote, I was approached by two young men, again, two synagogue families, one Beth Tikvah, one Beth David. Their request that I perform a commitment ceremony to consecrate their relationship. Their wish was threefold. One, that a rabbi be involved. Two, that the ceremony take place in a synagogue. And three, that the reception be strictly kosher. Recognizing that for me this would represent somewhat of a leap, I suggested conditions that I would impose, which potentially could have been deal breakers. As a commitment ceremony and not a classical wedding ritual, the blessings would be different. The ketubah, not the standard text. The ritual not parallel to a typical male-female wedding ceremony. In a heartbeat, the guys agreed. They were not looking to make political statements, not looking to be a test case, but simply looking to be welcomed as two committed, delightful, knowledgeable young Jews into the traditional Jewish community. I could not, nor would I, decline their request, my no vote 9 years earlier notwithstanding. The ceremony took place at Beth David. The ofruf took place at Beth Tikvah, by the way. And the ceremony may have been one of the most moving life cycle events of my career. The tears of joy, the ruach, the spirited dancing, including a significant representation of the Orthodox community, made that winter evening something that I have never forgotten or will ever forget. Yes, change can be tough. It can be challenging. It can be controversial. In the realm of Jewish tradition, it's even more difficult as past meets present, as ageless tradition encounters modern-day sensibilities. That's why, for thousands of years, we Jews have cherished Torah Sheba'al Peh, an oral tradition that mitigated the limitations of an ancient, often time-bound text. As my own experience suggests, change can be slow, should not be rushed, needs to be thoughtful, and not unduly disruptive. We've done a lot of changing as a people, especially in response to the upheavals of modern times and the at the long last return to Israel. Tshuva, the call of us this season, demands of us change in how we live our lives, in how we treat each other, and suggests to us that when and where improvement may be necessary. Through tshuva, we can be enabled better to navigate the paths of life, leading us to strengthen those who look to us for guidance, to be there for those who need us, and to encourage all of those around us. Ken Yiratzon and Shabbat Shalom.